Senior Research Scientist at the Columbia School of Social Work and co-founder of the Columbia University Justice Lab. Thank you all very much for being here today. We want to try to get this done expeditiously because we want to honor people's times. We know there are a number of members of the media that are live streaming into this today, and they all work on deadlines, so we want to try to get this all done in about 45 to 55 minutes, after which we'll break very shortly, and then have a follow-up panel from around 10:30 to around noon. So thank you all for coming. Thank you folks on the live stream. I hope you're able to hear me. Up until late last night, the furthest away person who had registered was from Alaska. But now, I'm sorry Alaska, you got beat out by Beijing and Ghana. So folks all around the country and all around the world are watching us today. And thank you all. So the first questions we'll take will be from the press. If you're on the live stream, you are able to ask questions. If you're a member of the media, please identify yourselves that way, and folks will be running questions up and down to us. I want to start by introducing the panel. First, you'll be hearing from Marsha Weissman, from the founder and former executive director of the Center for Community Alternatives, and now an adjunct professor at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. Then responding to that will be Patrick McCarthy, President and CEO of the Annie Casey Foundation and former head of juvenile justice in Delaware. Then we'll hear from Ana Bermudez. Ana has two roles in the world of close to home. One was she was Deputy Commissioner of Probation for Juvenile Services when the planning occurred for close to home, and now she's Commissioner of New York City Probation. And then we'll hear from Deputy Commissioner Felipe Franco, who is currently, he also has two roles that are super interesting. He's currently Deputy Commissioner at ACS in charge of implementing juvenile justice practices all across the board, including close to home. And before, when close to home was being negotiated, he was the Deputy Commissioner at the Office of Children and Family Services for New York State. So he had the kids then, and then when the kids left, he just got lonely and he followed them down to New York State. I want to start by thanking the Casey Foundation for funding us and funding this case study, and Patrick's leadership particularly. He came out a couple of years ago with a TED Talk. If you folks haven't seen it, you should see it. It's fantastic. It talked about closing youth prisons. Patrick and I then co-authored a paper at the Harvard Kennedy School about closing youth prisons and got to talking about how, as states struggle to figure out how to downsize their systems, they really sort of need better and more information about the experiences of places that have done so. So here we are in the biggest city in the country, New York City, and the city has completely opted out of using state training schools, state youth prisons for its kids. So Patrick funded us to look into this. The Casey Foundation funded us to look into this and look at the outcomes. What generated this, what outcomes are there, and what lessons can other jurisdictions from Beijing to Ghana to Alaska learn. We originally were going to do this and target it for the fall. Then close to home got zeroed out in this year's budget. So we thought, well, we have some initial findings. We should at least bring folks together to have that conversation, talk about the initial findings. We will come out with a fuller case study in the fall, but today's event is at least to have a discussion around the findings that we have so far. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Marsha Weissman, who is the lead author on the case study, who can take you through some of the findings. Thank you very much.
Okay, so my main challenge will be to see if I can click and talk at the same time. And if you want to take a bet, I would bet no. So it's great to be here and seeing so many faces and friends who I've been seeing in a couple of years since I retired from being an executive director of the Center for Community Alternatives. And working with Vinny is sort of like the implementation of close to home, like warp speed, right? We're going to do this. And so I'm going to start by laying out some of the things that preceded close to home and place it in context. And now I have to click. So the next couple of slides will give you a sense of the foundations, the early reforms that preceded close to home. But preceding these early reforms was a period that many of us will remember when we called children super predators, right? And get tough on kids, get tough on crime, get tough on kids. And close to home is sort of one in a long list of reforms to push back on that. New York City, even though it was affected by the super predator era, always had some foundation of looking at juveniles as children. The city funded alternative to placement and alternative to detention programs early on. I know my organization worked with juvenile offenders even as early as the early 1990s. And then there were these fabulous advocacy groups. But by the early 2000s, government began to shift its focus, and that made a huge difference. There were institutional changes. I'm not going to go through every bullet on this slide, but ACS and DJJ merged. There was a change in frame from punishment to care of children. There were some very important reforms, particularly the risk assessment instrument developed by the Mayor's Office for Criminal Justice that reduced juvenile detention. And all of that helped to set the stage for close to home. Close to home came into being in 2012, and Vinny is going to discuss the crime stats that both preceded and continued since close to home has been initiated. But long story short, and it's worth repeating over and over again, juvenile crime was declining before close to home and continues to decline after close to home, which really underscores the possibility of deinstitutionalization without jeopardizing public safety. Uh-oh. I didn't think that was going to happen. Close to one of the things that we've been finding out in our initial interviews with some of the key stakeholders who were responsible for bringing close to home to fruition was the remarkable convergence of political will. State and local officials, policymakers were able to set aside tensions, disagreements, some of them contentious, to achieve this reform, which they believed would be for the betterment of youth. And I think close to home represents not only an example of what is good for kids, but also what good government can look like when officials can work together and put aside less important differences. We see here he was governor-elect at the time, with Gladys Carrion, who was commissioner of OCFS at the time, touring Tryon, where a young person had been killed because of misuse of restraints. And he viewed this, governor viewed an empty facility, at least empty of children, but still staffed, right? Shortly thereafter, Mayor Bloomberg paid a similar visit to another facility, and essentially both agreed that this was fiscal irresponsibility, that taxpayers were paying essentially to keep correctional officers, if you will, employed, but not doing much for youth justice. It took 2 legislative sessions to get close to home passed. But lest you think that that's a long time, it should have passed the first year. think of other reforms, juvenile and criminal justice system reforms. Think of drug law reform. That was like 30 plus years. So that really was a fast-paced reform. In addition to fiscal irresponsibility, there were humanitarian concerns about the conditions in which kids were being treated in OCFS facilities. A number of reports came out. Probably the most definitive was the Department of Justice letter on its findings of its investigation of the condition of OCFS facilities at the time, calling out OCFS for not protecting children from harm, right? The inappropriate use of restraints, and particularly also for not attending to their mental health needs. There was a task force on reforming juvenile justice. The slide says demands, and I see Jeremy Travis in the audience. I don't think we call them demands, we call them recommendations. But essentially, you see them listed, and one of them was keeping kids close to home. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vinny, who's going to review some of the data.
So the next couple of slides, I want to call them sort of data stew. We're not trying to imply causality one way or the other. You will see declining rates of youth incarceration. You will see declining crime. We don't mean that the one caused the other either way, but that they coincided. The big story is lots fewer kids locked up, lots less arrests, lots fewer arrests. And so at the very least, our conclusion is that you could lock a lot fewer kids up and not have a crime wave, but we're not saying that the one way caused the other either way. So if we stretch this back, which we will do in the final report, you'll see declining rates of juvenile detention in New York City, and those in many respects match up with the amazing juvenile detention reforms that Marcia mentioned earlier. During this time, suffice to say, 2012 was when close to home started getting initiated. Very sharp declines in juvenile detention. This is pre-adjudication and slightly better than the rest of the state, which is important because sometimes you have declines in placement, but kids stay in detention very long, and judges just sort of, the system, not just judges, but the system sort of stashes them there to sort of, okay, we can't get that state punishment, but we'll get a local punishment. That didn't happen. 2/3 decline in placements post-initiation of close to home. Very important. This was not just, let's move them from buildings upstate to buildings in New York City. Kids have definitely moved to smaller, more local, more rehabilitative juvenile facilities, and Felipe will be talking more about that, but they also moved out of placement entirely, and Commissioner Ana Bermudez will talk more about that, and that those declines occurred much more rapidly than what was going on in the rest of the state, which did not have a close-to-home initiative, and much more rapidly than the declines in crime. Why? In part, we believe, again, we're still working on causality, not the final report. The city did a couple of things. It established a dispositional reform steering committee. You can see the name down bottom. That included all the major stakeholders, got in a room, and said, who do we want to lock up and who don't we want to lock up? Who needs to be in confinement? Which young people? And the Casey Foundation helped us with that. John Jay helped us with that. And the Vera Institute helped us with that. And we did two major things that affected the population in that. One was we created a structured decision-making model, which essentially reserved placement services. Placement's the juvenile system's euphemism for incarceration. Placement for the kids with the highest risk and highest severity offenses. And we expanded the range of programming, and we did this consensually so that the prosecutors and the police and the judges had a stake. They were in there planning it because they were going to be the ones arguing for it or placing kids into it. And so we believe that helped reduce the number of kids locked up. And then for lots of folks, we don't have recidivism data, it's too early, and it's going to be super difficult to do an apples-to-apples comparison anyway, but we still should try. But we don't have recidivism data. What we do have is arrests declined in New York City for juveniles very substantially post close to home, more than half, more than they declined in the rest of the state, and more than they declined in the 4 years prior to the close to home being passed, twice as much as that time. Now, there was a big decline in stop and frisks. So again, we're not trying to imply causality, we're just saying it wasn't a jailbreak and kids did not go out and cause mayhem in bulk. There were some bad things that did happen, and we'll talk about those a little, but on balance, we had good arrest outcomes. Thank you.
So moving gently into the outcomes that we've been identifying to date. First of all, Close to Home embraces a youth development framework. And so the outcomes, in addition to the very important metric of recidivism, right, but that's not the only metric. The outcomes in terms of youth development would be education, family reunification, and engagement in pro-social activity. And Close to Home seems to be doing quite well on these metrics, particularly with regard to educational gains while the kids are in close to home facilities. And in fact, they've gotten better over the years. So at least while they are with a close to home provider and in Department of Education programs, they are making gains in education. Most kids leaving close to home facilities go back to their families. And if it's not their parents, it will more typically be another family member or a guardian. And lastly, and I think this is really such an opportunity, particularly for kids in New York City, that they can engage in pro-social activities in their community and in the city at large, which has a wealth of arts-related programming, sports programming, experiences that are really important from a youth development lens. There were challenges in the implementation, and some of them were associated, obviously, with the speed in which the reform was initiated. And while there was planning done in advance of the passage of the legislation, once the legislation passed, there was a mere 5 months to do a lot of things. Things that may seem boring, like contracting, right, and establishing policies, but without which reforms and initiatives can't be successful. ACS brought on experienced providers, but not all of them had experience working with the juvenile justice population. The Close to Home was introduced in 2 phases, the first being the non-secure placement. And so providers didn't really have an option to step up kids who were disruptive in the non-secure placement. But even then, it's an example of how both providers and ACS really worked hard to meet the challenges head on. And the providers came up, and I think Jeremy will talk to this, with at least a temporary stopgap to deal with some of the problems that might have been arising with some of the youth. And so I think it's also, frankly, remarkable that government sort of owned up to the errors. There were criticisms, they weren't defensive. They met them head on and implemented better monitoring, better supervision, better training, held the providers to do that with their staff, right? And the results are on this slide. AWOL incidents have declined, assaults in the facility have declined, the use of restraints have declined. So you can see that the sort of initial emphasis on what are we doing that's good for kids and that can further a juvenile justice reform didn't stop just with the opening of some of the facilities. And it will be an ongoing challenge. I mean, you always have to be vigilant about this stuff. There's a new, and Vinny mentioned, there's a new challenge right now, and this is why we're putting out our preliminary findings today, which is a financial challenge. And you can't continue a reform like this without funding, right? You can't hold providers to the best standards if you don't fund them properly. You can't work with kids in the best way without, frankly, money. And right now, close to home has been zeroed out in the executive budget. We've heard that it's been restored in the Assembly One House bill, and in the Senate version, I found this interesting, they didn't restore the money, but they did make a comment that they disagreed strongly with the governor's action. So hopefully it will be worked out in negotiations. And not only is that important just to sustain close to home, but close to home, one of the next challenges will be to accommodate youth who will now be eligible for close to home through the new Raise the Age legislation. So this couldn't be a worse time to think about cutting funding. There are this is a New York legacy, right? Anybody who was involved in starting close to home really can be proud of their effort. But to continue to own that sort of pride, it has to be continued and has to be monitored properly. And the new challenges are to take close to home throughout the state, again, deal with Raise the Age, and lift it up as a national model. As a researcher, I would say that we also need to do commission research on outcomes. And here are some additional resources and information. And these slides are going to be on the website, or are on the website, so you can see all of them there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody. Now we're going to turn it over to Patrick Mccarthy, the CEO and president of the Annie Casey Foundation, and he's going to give a national sort of reaction to the findings. Thanks, Patrick.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. As Vinny said, I'm trying to set this whole conversation in a national frame. The Casey Foundation has worked for the last 25 years across the country on juvenile justice issues. We've been working in 300 jurisdictions in 39 states over that time. And it's that experience which has led us to join the growing chorus of people who said it's time to abandon the failed youth prison model as the centerpiece of our approach to juvenile justice. Why do we conclude that? Well, first, it doesn't work. Ineffective. If your standard is that a young person who becomes involved in the juvenile justice system ought to be less likely to commit future crimes, the recidivism rates for young people who are incarcerated in these large institutional youth prisons should convince you that that's a failed approach. It not only doesn't put youth back on track, this approach actually derails you from their future. When we look at their mental health outcomes, their education outcomes, their employment outcomes, and in particular, their recidivism outcomes. So it doesn't work. This is the primary reason. The second reason is the model, in my view, is inherently abusive. Why do I say that? If you look at the record, there are more than 35 states where there have been documented instances of abuse, in some cases severe abuse, within these youth prison walls. And despite very well-intentioned, very skilled folks who've worked very, very hard to reform these institutions, inevitably, after a little period of reform, they fall back. Because the model itself is designed to essentially do almost everything that we know leads to abuse. A model itself is flawed. And third, this approach is horribly expensive, especially as the number of young people who are incarcerated has shrunk. The per child cost of incarcerating these young folks is astronomical. Now that's not only bad because of our attention to not wanting to waste public dollars, tax dollars, but these institutions literally soak up all the resources that could be available to invest in community, to invest in families, to invest in children's future closer to home. So the close to home legislation from the standpoint of the Casey Foundation is a critical exemplar of where we think the country ought to move. Not only do young people have an opportunity to stay literally close to home, but the way the legislation is structured, it means they're much less likely to be in a secure care locked program and much more likely to get the benefit of the resources that the community can bring to bear. We thought it was very important to test and challenge our own assumptions about how the law would work, and that's why we decided to support the work that you're hearing about today to evaluate. So what happened? We knew that any initiative, when it starts, will make mistakes. So it's going to be important to pay close attention so that in an ongoing way, folks can learn and correct, rather than sticking our head in the sand if something went wrong. Let's look at what might go wrong, and let's correct it. Second, we know it's important to have data to maintain the support of the broader community as well as the legislature in our attempts to make these changes. And finally, and very importantly, we want to share these results with the rest of the country. This is an incredibly important social policy change that we want to make sure is shared with other states, other cities around the country. It's important for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons it's important is because both the folks at the state level and the city level came together and acknowledged that what had been going on before was not working and needed to change. It's important because, again, instead of just deciding that young people would move from the state level to the city level in some kind of bureaucratic funding shuffle, instead of doing that and just transferring kids from faraway prisons to prisons closer to where they live, the New York City and New York State officials decided they were going to follow in the footsteps of places like California, Illinois, and Ohio, and actually try to see a very much of a changed system. At the bottom of this change is the basic belief that prisons are no place for kids, and that kids do best in supportive families who are supported by their communities. This change also recognized, and very important for our conversation today, also recognized you could not simply move young people out of secure settings and hope that the existing community services, probation light, if you will, would be sufficient to deal with young people with high needs. The dollars that were freed up by moving these young people out of the state prisons into the communities were invested in a whole range of the kinds of continuum of services that Vinny was talking about earlier. I'm not going to repeat all the statistics that you just heard. I think the ones that really caught my eye were the decrease in the numbers of kids who were in any kind of out-of-home placement, almost 70%. The decrease in the arrest rates, which again, without claiming causality, certainly argues against the notion that if you take these young people who've been locked up for many, many years upstate and put them in the community, New York City is going to see a crime rate. Well, the data certainly contests that. And perhaps most important and most encouraging is to look at the educational outcomes for these young people. 91% of young people passing their courses. These are young people who I would argue in their state setting, when they were in the youth prisons, were getting very poor educational experiences with the sense that, well, what do you expect? They're not going to be able to succeed. anyway. These young people are showing us that they can, in fact, succeed. Finally, the last reason I want to lift up for why this is such an important social policy change for the rest of the country to think about is because of the leadership that it represents. The governor and his people, the mayor and his people came together and they decided they were going to make this change in the way that they did it. And they decided that they were going to invest financial resources to make sure that it works. We know that this program cannot succeed unless there is ongoing financial support for the community-based services that they need. So I would hope that leaders at the city level and at the state level will continue to set this very bold example to the rest of this country. And I would leave you just with two thoughts about this social policy change. One is that at the Casey Foundation, we always say that if there's a program or a policy or an institution where you wouldn't want your own child, then you shouldn't want it for anybody else's child. Youth prisons fail the My Child test. That's number one. Number two, and this comes from a conversation I was having with Sister Paulette just before we started, and she was telling me about what was going on in her community. And I realized that this change actually has perhaps an unexpected benefit. And that is the energy and the support and frankly the love that is available in community is unleashed by giving folks in the community an opportunity to become engaged with these young people. She was telling me story after story of people who were volunteering or programs that had never worked with young people before coming together and saying, what can we do to make these young people successful? What could be better than that? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Oops, I did not expect that to happen. Can somebody help me get this back to a big screen? Anybody here know how to do that? While she's doing that, I would like to add to my technological prowess by telling you that for those of you who understand what tweeting is, I want to go back to the first slide. People are apparently tweeting using the hashtag, for those of you who understand what a hashtag is, close to home, with the 2 being the number 2. Close, number 2, home. Just go all the way back to the very first slide. Yeah, the dash, we have this behind us. See? Without further ado, Commissioner Bermudez.
Hello, everybody. As Vinny said, I had the privilege of being part of the leadership in this effort, and then now growing it into what it is today, and hopefully what it will become when Raise the Age comes into effect this coming October. And that's a very important place we're at right now, that this reform has allowed us to be in a really good position to do this well. So I won't go into that because that's for another day. So some of my comments, reactions to this is it's actually not an overstatement to say that there was a convergence of champions, many of whom are in this room today, and or representing people who were, in the mix. This was an incredible interagency collaboration that, as Marcia said, wasn't without conflict. We all, at some points, had to agree to disagree and see you in court if necessary. But where we all agreed, what we all agreed was that as a system, that the impact on the system was going to be tremendous. And that has proven to be the case, right? And this goes all the way back to the moment of arrest. And in New York State, probation has a role in the juvenile justice system starting at arrest, essentially, because after a youth gets arrested, a young person gets arrested, they come through our doors first to see if we're going to keep them out of the system altogether. So that was another value, that another proven by research, that young people, when they're kept out of the system altogether, even when they get arrested, do better. So that was, task number one. And the Department of Probation had already been in that, sort of in that vein for many years, but we were able to use this process to increase the amount of young people who were kept out of the system altogether come into, again, the existing champions, the law department as the prosecuting entity here in family court, had also, at that point, the same belief system, and often would kick back cases to us, or have their own, they expanded their own, alternatives to court options. So this was all happening, from the entry point all the way then to the end. Lest you think that the numbers have gone down as significantly because of the lower arrests, yes, that's a smaller pool. But when you look at then what happens with the kids that make it all the way, a fascinating story then comes in. Since we created 4 different levels of probation, for example, you see at the end of all dispositions, as in 2016, we're able to see that the lowest levels of sanctions, what are called ACDs and conditional discharges, are used slightly more now, actually, than placement. So, and then the rest of the bulk of the kids are spread over 4 layers of probation. So we have almost a perfect bell curve as to what happens. Our alternatives to placement programs are used 2.5 times as much as placement. The young people in our matrix that Vinny referred to, but it's too wonky to go into, those kids are not experiencing placement, the lowest level kids are not experiencing placement as a first, ever, rarely, as a, first disposition or sentence out of the system. Even at the violation of probation level, the courts, the stakeholders have so many more options that more young people, as a result of a violation, are resentenced to probation to either a different level, a different alternative to placement program, whatever, than going into placement. So the whole system has readjusted itself with this belief that young people can change, that young people can learn from this experience, and that we need to do this to prevent the ultimate mass incarceration process that's happening in the rest of the country. So I can't say enough how important this initiative has been. And again, very proud to be part of the teams that did this, and would be remiss not to thank Vinny, because he was the one. We need to do this yesterday, so get going, and in addition to the ACS folks that are in the room as well, Felipe, everybody else, but the Tasmanian Devil of Reform did that.
Next up is Deputy Commissioner Felipe Franco.
Thank you, Vinny. And how should we call Vinny? I mean, sometimes we can call him a disruptor. I don't think if we used to call you I mean, on the way here, I was thinking about close to home and data, but when I look at the room, there's so many folks who actually had so much to do where we are at. I mean, I'm thinking, Dean Travis, I mean, you had recently come from the Urban Institute to the city, and we were kind of new in the Eastern administration, you remember those days? And we had a chance to talk, I think, in your kitchen about, we should do something around juvenile justice, and think about building on your knowledge around reentry and the adult side, and the task force was created, and it was good, it was meaningful, and it was a report that wasn't just put on the shelf. And we at the state were doing a lot of work, even before Commissioner Carrion, around keeping kids closer to the community, investing in evidence-based programs. And we actually got along really well. I mean, when I look around the room, I mean, Jeremy and I will talk consistently about the kids in Children's Village, how can we coordinate better. Tim and I have been working since he was a Rikers, when I used to go and do research on the kids who were in Rikers on the District 79. So there was actually a lot of really good people, well-intended. But I think at the end of the day, what happens in the juvenile justice system is there's a lot of really well-intended people that are kind of full of arrogance. And we get really arrogant around believing that 160 miles away from New York City, in Albany, we actually know better than the folks in the communities in East New York and Bed-Stuy. And I think to what Sister Palet was maybe talking to Patrick is that folks in the community do have answers, and that's the place where we should go and get them. And I think that's what is most powerful about close to home. We did a lot of tinkering around the ages. I mean, there was a lot of coordination. I look at Lisa in the back, and Lisa and Leslie, and I had all of these monthly meetings just to figure out how a little kid from OCFS, who was actually a kid in foster care, would do better. So there were hours and hours and hours of meetings just to figure that out. But there were hours and hours around when we created the iPass so that the kids who were in the voluntary agencies would be supported better by evidence-based programs when they were coming out of those facilities. But it was a disconnection. No matter how well we tried to tinker around the edges, there were different systems. And there was a perverse kind of reality that, most young people, I think this is what Anna was alluding to, will begin their juvenile justice experience in a campus-like setting. Kind of not too far away from home, but far away from home. The majority of those kids didn't do well in those campus-like settings. The majority of them will be sent to OCFS farther away from home. And it was actually like a trajectory, if you look at the data, of kids kind of moving farther and farther away from home by failed effort of all of these really well-intended people. What Close to Home has done is actually has kind of forced us to work with a self-contained environment in New York City. And I think one of the things that we have learned about Close to Home, and looking at this in the back, is that it's about sticking to these kids. If we look at even at the data at the beginning of Close to Home, there was still some sort of tendency to believe that actually when a kid doesn't do well in a home, the best alternative to move into another home. Or even, the reality that sometimes we have to move a kid from NSP to LSP. The reality really is that we haven't moved almost no kid from NSP to LSP. In the last 3 years, we have moved no kid from NSP, LSP ever to a secure setting. I mean, when I was in OCFS, at any one moment, there were at least 50 kids that were fair young people who had begun in the juvenile justice system, and somehow we felt that they had to be in the secure settings. Have we ever moved a kid to secure? No. I mean, we haven't. And I think it's a realization that actually, if we really stick to these kids, they can do better. And the stickiness has to do with the kind of people that are doing the work. I mean, if you look at the agencies that are represented in the room, I mean, these folks, they're not in the juvenile justice system, they're in the children and family systems, in business. And these are the folks who actually run daycares and family enrichment programs. And they are the core of what makes New York City so good. And many of them have been hundreds of years around doing this work. And now they're stepping up to this population. And they're not going to let it go. Right? They're actually doing a significant amount of work to make it happen. So, I mean, I think we're where we are because suddenly we realized that we were full of it, that we didn't know more than 160 miles away in Albany, and that actually the solutions, and the solutions that we haven't even still come up because we have charities coming up, are going to be in the communities, in the neighborhoods, and the family units. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. That was fantastic. Let's give one more round for the whole panel. For those of you who are from other jurisdictions that are either in the room or also watching on live stream, so one message that several of the folks who talked about, but particularly Felipe's comments at the end, brought home that I think we all sort of need to grasp is that it's one thing to reduce the populations of these systems and to do what they call tinkering, even profound tinkering, where the numbers are coming down. It's an entirely different thing to completely stop using youth prisons, large state training schools. And that's what Patrick's TED Talk spoke about, and that's what Close to Home delivered. The biggest city in the country now no longer, as Felipe just talked about, sends its kids, at least the family court kids, the kids that go through what's called juvenile court in lots of places, to any large locked facilities. And that's a pretty profound moment. And that's a moment I know lots of folks who are watching on live stream are grappling with. They're grappling with it in Wisconsin, where the Republican governor there said he's going to close their remaining 2 youth prisons. They're grappling with it in New Jersey, where the Republican governor there said he's going to close 2 out of their last 3 youth prisons, and they're grappling with it in Connecticut, where the Democrat governor has said he's going to close their sole remaining youth prison. So, and there may be more that I don't know about, but that's what's happening around the country. Close to Home gives you one roadmap. It's not everybody's roadmap. New York City is not Milwaukee, but at least it gives you some of the elements that we went through. So that having been said, I'm going to open it up to media questions. I know that there are media on the live stream, and that will be conveyed to me through Mary Lee. So Mary Lee, you got any questions from the media? Yep. If not, get ready, all the rest of the folks.
No, we have a question from the live stream, but not media, so shall I?
You can prime the pump with the live streamers.
Okay.
Pick the ones furthest
Yeah.
away. I want to see if Ghana or
China's tuning in for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, China. Yeah, our live stream is over 100 people, and somebody wants to know how many close-to-home facilities are there in New York City up and running? Is it only the city or also in the state? And that same person has a second part of their question, which is, when the empirical evidence is presented to lawmakers on the impact of incarceration on the developing brains of youth, what is the rationale for not adopting those?
So let me ask Deputy Commissioner Franco to answer the first part, and then maybe Patrick or I can answer the second.
Yeah, I will answer the easy one. So
And speak to the mic, sir.
there's actually 30 close-to-home facilities as we speak, and that number will grow as Anna talks about raise the age. They're all mainly New York City or very close to New York City. Only less than an hour away. And the intent is that, young people have to show consistently. I mean, it's all about they proving that they actually can manage themselves better when they go back to the community. And the only way to do that is when you're close to your community.
So my response to the second question about why the brain science and developmental science isn't strong enough to convince legislators and officials to make these changes is essentially they need to see more proof points like close to home. They've got to be convinced that if they move away from the model that's been dominant for 150 years, that what replaces it is going to be effective in protecting public safety and in helping young people to get their lives back on track. We are now accumulating those proof points in all the states that Vinny mentioned, as well as a number of others. Close to home, I think, is the closest to a model that really is, I believe, the future of juvenile justice. Again, every state, every city will adapt its own version, but the reinvestment of dollars, the investment into community, the focus on individualized care for each individual youth, focus on data, evaluation, accountability for the young person, but accountability for the system, all of those, we need proof points like close to home in order to change how the rest of the country thinks about juvenile justice.
I think it's also a messaging issue, or how we talk about the brain science, because I think a lot of people who don't want to believe in this, whatever, use the brain science, depending how you talk about it, by saying, oh, you just want to let them off the hook. Is this supposed to mean that they're not guilty or not whatever? And what we really need to emphasize is that what we're trying to do is age-appropriate accountability. And that we have to take that into account, in my world of community corrections, there's this risk, need, responsivity. So age and their developmental capacity is part of the responsivity piece, even as we look at what behaviors are happening, right? So that we appropriately address that, and that the process can be one of growth and fostering maturity rather than, complete out old models of, old models of punishment and whatnot.
Okay. Next. We can go from questions in the rooms, folks. Yes.
So if it remains unfunded in the state
Hold on
budget-
just one second. Wait. I didn't say this earlier, but please wait till Mike's come to.
Okay. Hi, I'm with Juvenile Justice Information Exchange. So if close to home remains unfunded in the state budget, what are some of the specific things we're going to see happen to the program?
And you know, the way to think about this, I mean, first of all, you know, within the Family Court Act, within New York State, juvenile justice has always been a state local jurisdiction responsibility. I mean, it's the way it happens. Any young person who makes a mistake, I mean, not that far away from here in Yonkers, you know, the state will step up and actually, you know, take care of them in the facility, as good or bad as that facility could be, and only 50% of the cost will come to the city. In my mind, it's actually impossible to believe that the state is going to walk away from that responsibility, particularly when close to home is actually reducing the expense of the state. So, I mean, maybe I'm not in denial, but actually, you know, it's going to be an Albany Monday and Tuesday, and we expect it to be funded. I mean, it's the governor, it was a governor's priority, and it should continue to be a governor's priority. It's a priority for the city, for the mayor, for me, and everyone else in the city. We believe this is the way young people should be treated, and we will make it happen, with them or without them.
Yeah. Other questions? All right, well, I want to thank the panel. We are up to time anyway, so this is great. Thank you very much, and give the panel one more round of applause. For those of you watching on the live stream, we're going to take about a 5-minute break and have a few new panelists. Thank you, Patrick, is going to be moving on, and we will reconvene for about an hour and a half, close to home panel in about 5 minutes. Thank you, everybody.
No, it's
I'll throw a couple of questions out to the panel. They'll do some, they'll answer, but also folks on the panel, I'd like you to interact with each other. So if somebody says something that you want to react to, just kind of get my attention so that you guys can also have a conversation with each other. We'll do that for like 45 minutes to 60 minutes or so, and then we'll let you all jump in. So have questions of you all. I'm going to go and introduce the whole panel because some people might just be tuning in now. And I'll start from the left. It's Deputy Commissioner Felipe Franco, who is from currently at the Administration for Children's Services, in charge of their juvenile justice programming and services, but was at the state as Deputy Commissioner at the Office of Children and Family Services, when Close to Home was originated and discussed. Then we have Jeremy Tavares, who is a young person who was formerly incarcerated in an OCFS facility, and then later in a close-to-home facility, and now works at a close-to-home facility in Martin Decorah's as a youth worker. Then we have Commissioner Ana Bermudez, who is currently Commissioner of New York City Probation, but when close-to-home was negotiated, was Deputy Commissioner of Probation for juvenile services, for youth services, and was very intimately involved in kind of crafting close to home at the city level. Marsha Weissman, former founder of the Center for Community Alternatives, former executive director of CCA, adjunct professor at Syracuse University Maxwell School, and lead author of the case study we're about to do. And Jeremy Holman, CEO, president, founder, executive director, not founder. Not founder. From 1800. Boss man at the Villages, which ran private residential programming for young people prior to Close to Home, and now has several Close to Home facilities. So I'm going to go to the two Jeremys first, two newbies on the panel, because we've already heard from some of the other folks. You got to see the PowerPoint. Jeremy Tavares, I'll go to you first. You were in a Close to Home, you were in an OCFS facility before, and then a Close to Home facility, and now you're working one. What was the difference? What was the experience like at OCFS? What's the experience like in Close to Home?
Well, as a personal experience, OCFS was more like a prison for the youth that was incarcerated in there. Me personally, at the age of 13, being sent to a secure facility in upstate New York, I was over 6 hours away from my family, and it was pretty tough for my family because my mother did four kids, a single mother, so she didn't have a vehicle. We live in New York City housing. It's difficult to get up there.
Was she able to come up?
Yeah, I mean, she personally wanted to come up as much as she could, and I personally told her, nah, please don't do that. Just come once on my birthday. That's all I really need. And she agreed, but she really disagreed. But it worked out in my favor. But going back to OCFS, is personally as experiences traumatizing for a youth that goes up there. And you're incarcerated with youth that's I was 13 years old at the time. I'm there with people that are 18 years old. At 21 years old, you go into the Department of Corrections and you're sentenced for a long time. So being in that secure setting is really traumatizing for youth.
And what about the Close to Home facility? How does that differ?
Close to Home was a very different experience for me because I'm used to being incarcerated at that time. And after being released from OCFS, I got rearrested about 3-4 months after being released. And when I entered the Close to Home, I thought it was going to be more like an upstate facility, but into the city. And when I entered, I'm like, wait, where am I? Like, what's going on? And it was like different. It was a different experience. So
How so? Help bring, like, folks have, many of them have never even been in a place like any either kind of place. So kind of, what's the difference between your room? What's the difference between your daily activities? Like kind of what you used to do and what you do when it became a close to home situation?
Well, the comparison with close to home OCFS and room size is really different because close to home is basically like, I mean, certain facilities are a group setting, yeah, you're all bed together, but in certain facilities you have your own private rooms, like in Martin Quarters, where I was at. It's pretty, you feel like you're home, basically, but you're away from home. And they treat you like more like family, and they give you the support that you need to change your life the way you're supposed to be living, and they mature you and mold you to become the person you're supposed to be, instead of sending you upstate to OCFS in a little cell, and you're by yourself, and it locks in as soon as you close the door, and you're basically just another number in there, and they treat you like you're garbage, like you're just another animal locked up, and we're gonna get rid of you soon, so just do your time and get out of here. We don't really care about you.
What about, terrible, by the way, just sort of want to say that, but what about the programming? Was there a big difference, or was it similar between OCFS and ACS? School, how was that same or different?
It's a major difference between, if we talk about education part, it's very different. Because my personal experience, again, with OCFS, when I was at OCFS, I took all my regions, and I was released with, at the age of 16, with 38 credits, supposedly. And when I got into the city and I went to the Department of Education to go into community high school, they told me, oh, we don't have whatever you're telling us. Whatever paper you have is not correct, because in our system, you only have 16 credits and 2 regions. So I don't know where you got this information from. I'm like, what you mean? I have this information right in front of you. Like, this is what they gave me when I got released. And she said, no, that's incorrect. This is what you have, and this is what we're going to give you, because that's in our system. We can't really do nothing about it. I apologize for your inconvenience, but this is what it is. And
It's a little more than inconvenient.
yeah, and me at that age, I was 16, I was about to go crazy. Like, this is what's going on. And the good thing about close to home, that you're in the city in the Department of Education school, any type of credits and curriculums or regions that you take, you're going to get accredited back to you once you're discharged from the facility, because before you get discharged, they will put you in your community zone school. They will help you transition back into your community zone. If you want to go back to the former high school you was once in, they will put you back in there. If now you want to go to a different school, we will help you get into school where whatever support that you need and whatever fits your needs for school, we will put you in there. And that's the good thing about it.
Marsha, as you were researching this, what did you hear about the situation between the schools at the state level and then when ACS took over close to home?
Well,
And DOE?
so 2 things. First of all, the educational programming in OCFS varied, but in general was not as strong. And because the whole environment was so anti-youth and anti-youth development, that even, and I've spoken to some teachers in my years of work who taught in OCFS, even when they were focused on the educational outcomes, and that's what they were there for youth, the environment countered that. The environment told youth every day that it doesn't matter what your education is, because you're garbage and you're not going to need it, and you're just going to wind up in prison anyway. Then there's the big problem of transferring credits, and that's a statewide problem. And it's really heartbreaking to see kids, young people, who have worked hard, even in OCFS, to earn credits and get decent grades, to then take it to their school district, only to be told, these don't count. You're just sending this incredibly bad message that hard work and being attentive to education and academics and all of that doesn't mean anything for us. So the message from both sides is really terrible. And OCFS, close to home, has, for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which is that it's in the community, and the Department of Education is partnering with close to home. It's not perfect, but to say these are also our children. right? And this is our educational system, and our kids are in this system, so it's much better.
Jeremy Coleman, I'm going to go to you, and I'll come back to you. I want Jeremy to have a shot at getting in. You run one of the oldest youth-serving organizations in the New York metropolitan area, and have served kids before Close to Home existed, have served kids now. I'd like you to sort of give us your wisdom from both of those perches, vis-a-vis the research that we just talked about, but also in terms of what Jeremy just talked about.
Sure. So let me kind of give you a little bit of the historical perspective. And you're right, we were serving OCFS kids that were stepping down from state facilities prior to Close to Home. And we really thought we knew what we were getting into. I mean, I gotta be honest, we didn't. We screwed up pretty badly early on. I'm saying that on TV here. I know that's Jeremy. That's the difference between wanting something done well and working on the ground and getting it right. So I'll tell you the places where we really went wrong. One was we absolutely wanted to create what Jeremy described, and what we all wanted, right? The therapeutic approach, one where we focused on family, one where we recognized the disproportionate impact of race that we often talk about in secret, but we were willing to put it up front and open. And Vinny, you remember when we were going up to Albany to negotiate this. Those are the same things we talked about, and we agreed with it. But the day Close to Home happened, we realized that our staff were quite unprepared. Not simply because of the problem with the short timeline that Marsha described. We had 5 months, but because the rules were different too. So for instance, we had spent 3 years negotiating with our staff and our unions and training them around no restraints for children in child welfare. And our intent was to bring the Close to Home kids right into our child welfare population, because we really didn't see much of a difference, and we still don't. But the rules with Close to Home was, if you try to walk away, a restraint is not just appropriate, it's required. It took us a year to get that right. Because staff were like, well, what's the rule? What's the rule here? How do we do it? We struggled to blend the populations well. We didn't always get that piece right, because we had convinced our staff and our trustees, and to a great extent our donors, that these were the same children that we were always serving. But we hadn't really figured out what expectations were different, and it was confusing for staff. And I don't think it was just confusing for our staff, it also was confusing for OCFS and ACS staff in trying to figure that thing out. And the last piece that I think we struggled with, and it was a surprise to us, was we wanted families engaged from day one. But we realized that when we went to some of our families, and they came out and saw us, and they saw our facilities, they were like, well, you know what, he's safer with you. This is better. And that was really heartbreaking, because at the end of the day, every one of our children, they wanted to go home. And we needed to radically change how we approach this. And I think part of the reason was there were family members like Jeremy's mother that had gone up to OCFS and seen those facilities, and they were coming and seeing ours. And you've been there, Vinny. Our trustees have, since 2004, done an amazing job of creating space and giving us money to create beautiful space. And families would come up and say, well, why are you putting pressure on me to take him home? Because you know where I'm coming from, right? And we had to go back and tell our families and our staff, look, let's talk about the communities in New York City and Westchester where our kids come from. They're predominantly segregated, intentionally segregated for 100+ years. They have failing schools. They have tons of police enforcement issues going on there. What is it? It's not because our families don't care. It's because they're afraid. And so let's find a way to work with them that's different, so that they understand this. And in the end, I think that's what worked for us, is trying to help families understand that not only were we there to help children be safe and, help them get that kind of, which Anna said, the age appropriate consequence for whatever they think the behavior was, but that we would also be with them on the long run. And the person that helped us with that was actually Felipe Franco. He was the first one that actually understood frontline practice, and that's, I think, because when he went to OCFS, he owned it all. And when he came back, he said, we got to do something different, and helped us change practice.
Before I go to you, so you talk a lot about the early challenges. Is that the way it is today?
Not at all.
And if not, so tell us how it is today.
Right.
And tell
So-
us how you got there. Like what combination of factors got you from wherever you were to wherever you are now?
So I think at the front line, the biggest change for us was making sure that our the staff that interact directly with our kids and families understood that what we needed to do, which was, look, we were not making excuses for this issue of public accountability, right? We didn't want staff to have any confusion about what a child did. We figured that the courts and ACS would help us navigate that piece of the business. That our job was to make sure that kids got the best care and the type of care that we would strive to give our own children. And working on that, and that's, when you're in direct practice, that's an everyday issue. It's just like our own kids, you never walk away from it because it's never fixed, you can always do it better. And then there were some changes that we had to make in how we saw the problem. Was that we were simply not here to provide a set of days of care and maybe a few days of aftercare, but that we really needed to think bigger about the problem, and that really changed us. So we have a very clear hierarchy on what we think young people need, and Jeremy, feel free to challenge me on this. First, we absolutely believe that it is our job to create belonging for young people, that every young person needs to have at least one appropriate, willing adult in their lives that cares for them unconditionally, and that would never be Children's Village or ACS or OCFS, because we come and go, right? They need, and rather than saying, this young man, he went into OCFS at 13, he has no one, he's been in the child welfare system forever, to say, now that he's with us, this is an important time, let's figure this thing out. Is there an aunt, is there an uncle, is there a teacher, does he have family in Georgia, is there family in Puerto Rico, wherever that is. So one person of unconditional belonging. The second is stable housing. It really doesn't matter if kids have a great experience in close to home and then end up in the shelters, or if they're out there couch surfing, because bad things happen when you've got to trade your dignity for room and board, right? So then you're either taking drugs, you're giving sex, you're making choice. There's no free room and board in New York City, I'm sorry, unless it's with your mother or your father. If you are transient, you are trading, and those trades are bad. The third is, and this is still true today, our kids, because they're poor, because they've been segregated intentionally, they have had no exposure to all the things that you and I take for granted every day. Zero. Maybe a little bit. They don't know what's free in this city. They have had very little exposure for the great opportunities in this city. And we find the more they're exposed to, the more they're excited about life, right? Or the way we say, I can't change the fact that you were born black or brown, but I can change how you think about life and survival, because if you survive long enough, you can go on to change the system, but not if you're locked up, right? Or if you're dead. And the last is access to opportunity. Our kids, so they come with poor education. I know we do a better job, but it's still poor because of where they come from. These neighborhoods are not only segregated, they also have most of the failing schools in New York City are in these very same neighborhoods. And the reason our kids don't go out and the reason they don't compete well in the job market is not because they don't want to. It's because they were never given that opportunity. And that first moment when someone said, hey, you did a great job. I remember the first time someone told me that I did a great job. It got me really excited about being a dishwasher that day. I kid you not. But that is okay. I mean, we all have started somewhere, right? And the day someone tells you that you've done a great job, or that you're good at it, or that you make it look easy, all these phrases, that's when you begin to think of yourself as an independent person. And we see close to home as that opportunity when we can create that sense of being, that, hey, you can go on and be a great, Jeremy, someone must have told you, Jeremy, that you'd be great as a youth care counselor. I can't imagine that you just thought you'd be good and that's how you ended up here. Someone told you that.
I mean, something similar to that, because I did keep in contact with Martin Porras upon my release multiple years after, and they did mention after multiple years, like, you ever tried working with kids? Like, nah, I'm not going to, I'm okay. And after multiple years working, I was a glazier when I got released, and after about 3-4 years, I was like, you know what, let me give it a shot, because this glass thing ain't working out for me. And I'm tired of this, and I gave it a shot, and every day I wake up happy to go to work when I go.
How cool is that, right?
It's totally
I mean, that's what we all want. We have to go to work.
So Felipe had a comment and then Anna has a comment.
I think this is an important, when we think about close to home and education, if close to home would have been designed by juvenile justice correctional folks, education wouldn't have been the way it is. I mean, we would have done what everyone does in correctional settings. You think about reducing transitions, making it easier on staff. You think about making the schools as close to the hall or to the living unit, and to actually do everything that you can to prevent kids from being mixed up. The folks in New York City, possibly because of Tim Lisanta and others at the DOE, couldn't get away with what they get away everywhere else in the nation. Like, there have been realignments elsewhere, as you know, really. I mean, but the reality moving from those state facilities in California to the camps in probation in LA is not that different, just a different entity. Not in New York City. Close to home kids don't go to the school in the same building. I mean, most of them in NSP. They actually have to wake up in the morning, which is a young man's job to get those kids early up, get them in the van, do all the things that they have to do in the morning, get them to a school that actually feels as close as a community school can feel to, where they're actually together with kids from all of these multiple homes. And it didn't go well at the beginning, and Sister Paulette may remember that she thought that idea was crazy, and she kind of opposed that her kids actually went to that school. I mean, that has changed. But 2 weeks ago, during spring break, during the winter break, all the kids from close to home actually were playing basketball in a close to home NSP citywide basketball tournament. And the reality is that the DOE forced us to actually make that experience as close as the experience of those kids when they go home. So I think that one of the things to learn about close to home is the intentionality of not doing things based on what juvenile justice folks want to do. If you're going to do education, do what educators will tell you to do.
That's great.
Jeremy actually addressed what I was going to say. So.
Washer, Jeremy?
Yeah, just reflecting particularly on what Jeremy said. As we move forward with close to home reform and other juvenile and either criminal justice reforms, I think it's imperative that we pay attention to the nuances of what it means to say what I want this for my child. So a nicer facility is very important, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. And the challenge is, and I think it's really in some ways unfair, that great juvenile justice reforms are in some ways then held responsible for transformational changes for young people that, and I'd say transformational changes, not just changes, right? For young people that then have to return to environments characterized by structural poverty, structural racism, and structural classism. And what prompts me to say that was your point about how giving kids opportunities and saying good job, right? That's a nuance, right? That's not often put in sort of a program manual or a best practice. We're very clinical about those things. But at least when I was a practitioner, the kids that I worked with never had opportunities to show their best selves. We all have multiple selves, right? And they're never given opportunities to show their best selves. They're never picked for the school's, presidential, student council. They're never selected for those things. And so they're left sort of relying on the negative self part of them, and we all have that. And I've been astounded that once you give kids those opportunities, that kind of nuance really makes a difference. So I think, I like that Patrick called these reforms, characterized them as social policy reforms rather than juvenile justice policy reforms. And if you think of it that way, this is just the tip of the iceberg about what further reforms have to happen in the very structure of American society.
Thank you, Marshall. Jeremy, I saw you sort of nodding a little when Marshall was talking. Does this stuff, what she was saying about giving kids the opportunities, and Jeremy as well, does that resonate with you and kind of react to that for me, would you?
I mean, it actually does, because in, like I said, OCFS, you don't got opportunity to do anything at all. You're pretty much going there, you're just another member on our roster, and this is our census. You'll be released or transferred to somewhere else, and we really don't care. And close to home, they give you chances to do a lot of things that you've never been exposed to. And in Passages Academy, they do, like she said, student council, things like that. They do have those things, student council and different type of programs inside the school that you would never take part of if you was in your community school still in the neighborhood. And that makes a major difference for a lot of youth that are in our system, because when they go home, they have a different picture on certain things and how to relate. It's a major difference.
I want to take a slightly nerdy turn in the conversation here. The Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators emailed the live stream information out to the leading juvenile correctional administrators in the country, right? And I particularly want to go to Anna and Felipe on this, because both of them are kind of nerdy, but also because I want you to talk to your fellow, your colleagues in the field, and just sort of maybe talk them through a little about some of the nuts and boltsy stuff that we did. In the break, Anna, you and I were talking about the Dispositional Reform Steering Committee and how kind of totally in the weeds we had to get so that at the end of it, you have a good thing. And I wonder if you could maybe just take people there a little bit, and Felipe, you as well. By the time you got here, it was only about a year and a half after Close to Home had started. I gotta think there was still an enormous amount of implementation challenges to face, and I'd like it if you could just to say, if you're in Milwaukee or Philadelphia, two places I know have contacted me, and I know you all have been given lots of tours of facilities, and I know Connecticut came, and I know LA came to tour both close to home facilities and probation. There's lots of places that are looking at this. Give me 2 or 3 of the lessons you can think of from your experience as administrators trying to make it happen and happen well.
I'll try to answer that question. I think what it took for us, well, the fact that we had that committee, that larger committee, Dispositional Reform Steering Committee, that had sort of the principles of a lot of the agencies that had to work together, was important, but the real work got done in the subcommittees, right? So then we had these subcommittees, one of which was placement, one of which was the one that I co-chaired for community-based interventions. And I guess
One was education, too.
and one was education, right? I'm sorry, I didn't name all of them. So it was education, community-based interventions, placement.
That's not it.
Yeah,
Oh, data. I think it was
data. Michelle, how could I forget? And data, right? Because we were also trying to be very, we wanted to approach the movement, if you will, from all sorts of places. Some people were going to react to it's the right thing to do, for adolescents and so on and so forth. Some people were going to react better to data. So we wanted to have all the bases covered, basically, right? And then for my committee, we had to bring together disparate groups. We had to bring prosecutors, defense attorneys, somewhat the court system. The judges here don't tend to participate in these kinds of things explicitly. We have representatives from the court system, education, our mental health, court-based mental health providers, etc. But what we did was we first had a lot of conversations around values and about, okay, if we're going to do this, what are going to be the deal breakers for you? What are going to be the really important things for you? What are some of that I did individually with the leaders of those entities, right? So that we knew when we got into the room what were the expectations. We also set up a lot of expectations of we're going to have to agree to disagree. We're going to have to muddle through, details that, but nobody was allowed to diss anybody else. Certainly not in the group, right? And that was, I think, establishing that, even that humanity of the group, of like, we know we're gonna have, different views, but we're gonna assume that the views are not because we don't want what's best for the children, right? And that was a fundamental, I think, value system that we were able to carry throughout our conversations. The dispositional matrix we came up with was, I think it took about 8 drafts of that, and arguments and disagreements and that kind of stuff. And this will work, and this will not work. We came up with a system of making recommendations when a kid, when the recommendation was an alternative to placement or placement. We came up with a system for making a recommendation to court that was not ideal, and is not ideal still. It was what we could come up with the best that we had, with the silos that we couldn't bust, and so we continued to tweak it, but that's what we've got. So not everything was, in the ideal version. So I think those, in terms of lessons, I would say, invest the time, whoever's leading this process, whether it's a subcommittee or it's a committee, spend time talking to people in the other agencies and other entities that you have to work with, to see where they're coming from, to see what it is that they're, where the negotiation rooms are. And we ended up actually with some things, like I said before, let's see, what was, so the matrix takes into consideration in making the 2 axes are, risk of rearrest by through a risk assessment instrument, and the other is offense severity. So the offense severity of our matrix is the offense severity of the arrest, not of the adjudication. And there was a lot of disagreement about that, right? We all agreed that for what we had, that was the best option, and everybody agreed to then litigate it in court if, let's say, the defense thought that was too high of a charge to be plotted into the matrix, if the prosecution thought the same or under, or whatever it was. Ultimately, it was a court's decision as to what the ultimate, and we've seen a lot of times now, there's underrides, what we call underrides to the recommendations, right? Or even some of the agreement, or the prosecution says something, the defense says something, and the judge will decide something lower, sometimes higher. And so we've been, sort of plodding that along. And just the system has has done the learning curve. It's just been a fascinating process, frankly. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, great, thank you. It's a complicated stew.
It is.
And I think, building on what Anna's talking about, the city did an amazing job of thinking about the structured decision-making process in the court. And by the time I get to ACS, following the CFS, as you said, close to home, had
When was that, Felipe?
What?
When did you come? So close to home, starts...
I came when guys started told me to come.
Close to home starts September 2012. You get here...
About a year. Yeah, 2014. Same year. And I think the first thing I do, I go and meet with Anna, and close to home felt clunky, still feels clunky sometimes. The social decision-making process that Anna described, and we could talk for hours about, is kind of a meaningful way of thinking about the value of keeping kids in the least restricted setting. somehow then it gets to this jump into placement, which close to home at that moment it just was one possibility. And I think, we spend a significant amount of time thinking about Mccarthy who's in the back, and others thinking about, so when we have limited secure, how we are really going to continue to follow the values of making decisions the right way based on the values of the district representing. And we spend a significant amount of time, going back and forth about what are the predictors that should really lead us to have a kid in LSP. And, so far, very few kids make it to LSP directly. Even very few kids are
LSP is limited
secure. But I think what I think I would tell my partners at the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators is that this work cannot happen on the facility side without actually talking to your partners in probation. And that was the challenge I think I encountered when I came close to home. There was no alignment. I think we're not there yet. But the work that probation and ACS have been doing for the last 4 years about understanding what we do in detention and detention risk assessment instrument, and we see it the same way, we do it the same way. The way that we're actually using under the guidance and leadership of John Dixon and many of the folks in this room, implementing the YLS. Every kid in
YLS
is the youth level of services instrument that probation began using to determine where the kid will go in terms of their continuum, but we were not using that in close to home. Now, John, tell me if I'm wrong, every kid who's in close to home actually gets a YLS, but it's helping to determine when he goes home and what kind of supports he gets home. So this alignment of systems, I think, is what is challenging to many of my counterparts across the state. Probation and juvenile justice are hardly ever in the same place together, except in Maryland and a few other places. And they hardly ever create continuity of values and instruments and philosophy. I think that's the power that we have in the city. We are really intentionally aligning our practices, and we work with the same kids. We just want to make sure that we build on what effort we had before. That's unique. You were talking about my friends in the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators. Whenever I go and meet with them, it's like at least twice a year, they don't get it. They really don't understand what close to home is. They understand what a small group home setting is. And I think what we open up with is that there's always a lot of tinkering in juvenile justice. Almost every state that I've talked to is trying to build some sort of close to home light. So maybe it's actually close to home, group home for kids who are coming back from institution. Maybe it's a group home for the low risk kids. What you push us to do, Vinny, and I'm blaming you, is that let's forget about just doing the small group home settings for some kids. Let's just do them for all the kids. And I think that's the challenge. I said maybe Peter in Massachusetts, everyone is trying to build some sort of close to home setting. No one is daring enough to do it for all the kids.
So I'm going to ask the next question I ask will be the last question before I turn it over to the audience. And it's going to be, where are we going? What's the future? Especially now we have two big things looming. One is the city raised the age, the state raised the age of juvenile court jurisdiction. For those of you who are not familiar with New York, today the court's jurisdiction ends on your 16th birthday. October, it'll end on your 17th birthday. Next October, it'll end on your 18th birthday. So this system now will incorporate 16 and 17-year-olds. It didn't incorporate them before. So close to home only affected kids who committed their crimes before 16. So one, we're getting a whole bunch of new young people who are slightly older than the young people that came before. And two, there's a budget threat. So for those of you who want to comment on how that might affect the future, feel free to do so. But I definitely want you to talk about the 16 and 17-year-olds. But I'm not going to answer that question yet. This room is very interesting, and I've heard several people comment on how it's like a family reunion on close to home. Right? We could have interchanged many of the people sitting here with many of the people sitting there, easily. So let me start, and you can get your camera ready to sweep the room, all right? Let me start by asking anybody who worked on this from a government level to please stand up. That means you were at the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, you were at ACS, you were at probation, any of that stuff. Any people... Stay standing. Anybody who worked on this from an advocacy level, from the Children's Defense Fund, from Correctional Association, from all those, from Citizens Committee for Children. Anybody who worked on it from a not residential, a community-based program space, alternative to placement, please stand up.
Sister Colette?
Anybody who worked on it from a placement ran close to home facilities, at least in. So you can see this was not just the 5 people sitting up here that did this. This was a sort of really interesting city, state, but also city, government, non-governmental agency process. Okay, you guys can all sit down. And now turn, who wants to go first? What's the future like? Thanks, everybody.
Okay, I guess I'll take it because the majority of the young people who are underage age are going to come through our doors first. I think, well, basically we have to build our staffing because we're going to have higher volume. But we plan to continue with the same value system and then addressing any gaps in services that we see, right? So if we're going, we have a certain percentage of young people we divert from court in the first place, making sure that we can certainly keep that level and or increase it by looking at where, if there's other opportunities for engaging the young people and serving them in the community, outside of the court system. Same with, we'll continue using the decision-making process. We may need to add an alternative to placement program at some point. Right now we have enough capacity to start, this. But the biggest thing for our future, for at least on the probation side, is that we run a mentoring program called Arches, which is uses as mentors. There are credible messengers, young people like Jeremy from the community who've had the experience of having gone through the system and have insight as to what that's been like and have made a turn in their lives. And that has, the reconviction rates have plummeted, for the young people who are in that mentoring program. And these are the young people who, like 75% were disconnected from school. Almost none of them had a job. Doesn't mean that Arches gets them in that space, but it's a sort of decision making, and I could go on forever about it. We need that in family court. We're going to need that in family court at various levels because the impact of Arches was strongest with 16 and 17-year-olds. We have capacity within Arches still to grow that, but we have so many 16 and 17-year-olds that are going to come in that we're going to probably need to expand. But we also need to address the issues that Arches addresses more upstream, and there's opportunities, I think, to do that. So for us, the future is really exploring this connection of young people who are in the community already, who've experienced the process, who can mentor and counsel the young people, because that's what they listen to. They don't listen to me. They don't listen to their POs half the time. Even the best POs. They listen for a little bit, but also the PO's not in their community. So if I may use you as an example, if I run into Jeremy all the time, and Jeremy's like, hey, like what's going on or whatever, and it is a source of both inspiration, advice, support, somebody who can listen to me. And that's what we heard when we did the close to home, we did some close to home community town halls. The young people said what we need is mentors because we're at a stage where our parents are important, but we're not going to talk to our parents about all this shit. I'm sorry.
There's no bleep button. I also want to go on record that I was not the first person to do
Yes, it would have been. I'm sorry. But that, it just makes sense. Again, age-appropriate accountability, and they're telling us this is what they need, and we insist on putting them in therapy, or giving them family counseling or whatever, and that we really need to hear out our young people. So, also that's part of the future, having them, contribute.
Cool. Others?
Yeah, we all getting ready for Raise the Age, 207 days from now.
But
I wish you hadn't put it that way.
And there's going to be impacts in every one of the pieces of the continuum. I mean, I think on the close to home side, I mean, we need to continue to do what we're doing. I mean, we need to continue to build on alignment of the work that actually done by probation. I think the work on the reasoning responsibility is really, really promising. The folks here who do the work are embracing it really well. We're learning, again, continuity is important for kids. It wasn't the way it was set up. I mean, we're kind of fixing, we're getting Humpty Dumpty back together. I mean, so you know, we soon will have a system in close to home where the provider actually does the work with the kid in the residence, who knows them really, really well, 24/7. They're gonna be with that same kid when they come back to aftercare, and I think that's the way it should have been, and it's the way it will be. We are building, you know, new capacity of things that we never thought about before with support from probation, like our first evening reporting center that, you know, will soon be announced. I mean, so the place where, you know, kids could get really strong support that doesn't have to be a bed itself. And continue to think about what happens. I mean, Jeremy mentioned this. I mean, as we get the older population more and more, my concern is that there are going to be young people who don't have to be in placement, don't have to be even in detention. And the only reason that sometimes they are with us is because they don't have a permanency research. So we're trying to figure that out, and it's down the values of what we at ACS are all about.
But are they different? Are you worried that, I mean, since the 1900s, when New York established the juvenile justice system, 16-year-olds were adults and 15-year-olds were children. Mm-hmm. Are you worried that 16-year-olds are scarier, meaner, harsher, they're going to blow your places up?
No, and actually, no, that's not what keeps me up at night. I mean, you know, I think it's, what keeps us up at night is trying to do a little bit at once. And maybe, you know, today's a good day because we're looking about how close to home started and how easily it could have been given up on it. But it didn't happen, and, you know, now we're in a better place. I think race to race is going to be difficult at the beginning, and I hope that everyone here and everyone in the audience and everyone in the city not believe that actually 16 or 17 years should be treated that way. And even when things don't go well at the beginning, we continue trying.
And the budget?
Sure, we need the resources. I mean, the reality is actually 100% of, you know, I was talking to Jim, you know, let's pick up on Onondaga, right? So I was talking to my friends in Syracuse, and they know that they're going to get 100% reimbursement for every kid above 16 in that detention side, and 100% reimbursement for every kid who's going to go to one of the voluntary agencies. I mean, Jeremy may get 100% from the state for a kid from Westchester going to his facility, but the kid from New York City is not going to get anything from the state.
Others? Yeah.
So I think that that the challenge for the future is really political with a small p, right? These reforms are very fragile, right? And we live in a country and a state that has become addicted to punishment and incarceration. And when the 16 and 17-year-olds come in, it's going to be harder to get the outsiders, so to speak, to apply what Patrick called the My Child test. Some of these young people at 16 and 17, they're going to have grizzled, they're going to have beards. They're not going to look like 12, 13-year-olds. We're going to forget that their brains are still developing. And I'm not talking about nature of crime, I'm talking about what they're going to look like. And particularly if they are African American young men. And the way that racism has permeated the dominant culture's perception of young black men as being frightening. Inevitably, one of these 16 and 17-year-olds is going to do something that's problematic. And I'm not being cavalier about that. We don't want that to happen. That would be a tragedy. But that would not be a reason to throw out this very fragile but critical reform. And so those of us in the room have to stay the course. And we have to work together and be collective about how we push back against what is going to be efforts to undermine, not just raise the age, but take the whole thing down.
Jeremy, and we'll go to the two Jeremys last, and then we'll open it up to
Okay,
questions.
in that case, I think we should go to that Jeremy first. He deserves it. Come on, you first, Brian.
What's the future, and are 16 and 17-year-olds dramatically different than 15 and 14-year-olds?
I personally believe because I entered close to home at 16 because I still had a family case open, so I entered the close to home at 16. And to be honest, from the 15 to 16 years old, it's not really much of a difference. It's a year apart, and your brain is still undeveloped, to be honest. And
So you're not worried about Martin DePoros getting a bunch of 16-year-olds?
I'm not worried about the 16 and 17 years coming in because I was 16, 17 when I entered.
Right.
And I personally know how to react to certain things. It's all with these youth that come in, they just haven't learned how to be respectful, and it starts at the home regardless. It's a dysfunctional pathway coming in. So these youth that come in just don't know how to behave, and the reason that they say that 16 and 17 years old are notorious for violence, you put them in Rikers Island, what's gonna happen? They're gonna act out like violent. And you put them in a closer home setting, like when I entered, I thought I was coming into a jungle. And I walked in, I'm like, wait, this is different. So if you put them in a certain setting, that will change their behavior automatically. As soon as they walk in, they're gonna change their behavior. That's what happened to me. It takes a few days to get used to it and a few weeks to adjust, but you're gonna change your behavior and how you act to certain things because of the setting you're in.
Great, thank you very much. Jeremy?
I think a lot of good points. I do want to highlight what Anna said about credible messengers. I think we've done a lot of good things, and that's been neglected to some degree, and it's great to see ACS has really taken the lead in doing that. Anna and probation, and we do a lot of the Archers work with you. We love what we see. It's very powerful, and integrating it into ACH is a game changer. I think there are a few things we can learn from close to home as we go into ACH, right? In close to home, as we said here, we advocated and got it, and then implementation was so short that we ran into all these problems with implementation. Again, with ACH, we are on a very tight, what is it, Felipe, 210 days?
207.
207 days.
That's in my head.
That is really
Actually, it's
tight.
about noon now, so it's 260.
But there are some advantages, I think, from somebody that actually has to do both the residential and the community. The thing that keeps me awake at night is the residential piece. To all of you who like to just do a little bit of have your grandchildren around or your cousin around for a couple hours, if that's cool and fun, it's very different when they come to stay with you 24/7. And when we did close to home first time around, there was really no appreciation for what it meant to be on the front line, what it meant to not have public agencies agree with each other, and the repercussions are, everything gets sorted out between the agencies, but the repercussions are on the front line. Some underpaid employee working the night shift, and that's where the gut punch was. We've come a long way from that. I think ACS has a lot of frontline practice leaders, and OCFS just put out a RACH proposal, which is one of the best we've seen. Acting Commissioner Sheila Poole, I don't know how she pulled it off.
Only for upstate.
I'm sorry?
Only for upstate.
That's correct, but for upstate. And I want to include upstate though, because I think we would be so wrong if we were to pretend that close to home happened because of the mayor and the governor. Close to home and RACH happened because we had commissioners like Rocco Posey, remember Vinny?
Yep.
Who was out there with us early on, fighting the battle, convincing upstate commissioners and upstate detractors that at the end of the day we needed to do the right thing. And it didn't matter where that child was. That child may never cross the New York City line, but we needed to do the right thing. And so I think we've got a lot of upstate people that are also dependent on our success here. The last thing I would add is, the advocacy piece, actually looking back, was the easiest piece. The implementation is where we had to cut our teeth. The implementation is where we are exposed to the greatest criticism. And at the end of the day, and I'll end with this, because I think we need to see close to home RACH and certainly RACH as yet another opportunity. I agree with Jeremy. These young people are going to come with a lot that they haven't had. They're going to have 1/10 of what my own children have had, maybe less sometimes. But while they're with us, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 7 months, a year, that's an opportunity for us to do something different. And I think that one thing that we can do that's dramatically different, and this absolutely touches on the issue of race and the history of race in the United States, is that my guess is everyone here, including you now, Jeremy, we have had one privilege that's undeniable. It's the privilege of high expectations. Mm-hmm. We had people in our life that loved us enough to demand that we succeed, that corrected us, that loved us through adversity. That privilege of high expectation crosses race, and we need to give this to these kids, whether they are poor black, poor brown, or in Westchester and upstate where we're doing some work. They're coming from poor white families who have also been excluded and neglected.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to folks for questions, so think of them in a second. But I just want to sort of, the last part you said resonates with me because when I ran the juvenile system for Washington, D.C., and my own children were 12 and 14, and I ran it for 5 years. So they went through their whole teenage years while I was running that system, and they lived, you know, in a fairly white enclave. Actually, it was more mixed than white, but it was not poor. It was at least middle class, and there was some affluence. Just a few miles from where many of the kids grew up that were in the facility, who were exclusively kids of color. I ran that system for 5 years and never had one white kid committed to my care, and who were heavily lacking in opportunities. And I remember my daughter was trying to play viola at the time. And from the second she picked it up, it was very clear this was not going to be a good thing. She had my level of musical talent, which was nothing. And it was going to be horrible till she figured out that it was not good. But we rooted her on. And, we said her ode to joy was, Beethoven would weep, and I think it probably did. And it struck me that as I was bringing more and more opportunities to the kids in my system, how not only do kids of privilege have the opportunity to succeed, they have the opportunity to fail a whole bunch of times before they figure out what they're going to be good at. And for the other kids that we had in our system, it was like, if you got one shot at Shakespeare, you better take it, man, because you never know when that's coming around again. And that, we fixed a lot of that by the time I left. We just poured opportunities onto these kids. And as you all spoke about this, and the youth development, the positive youth development element of it, it's really heartening to hear that part of it, because nobody wants to be thought of as their worst act. None of us sitting in the room, and certainly none of the young people have come into our system, and the opportunities to help young people thrive are far too few and far between. And I'm glad to hear that that's a lot of what's on top of the minds of the folks that haven't implemented it or still implementing it. So let's turn it to the audience. I'm going to go, and you're going to have to wait till the microphone gets to you. I'm going to go first to Mary Lee, who's giving us questions from Ghana, I think.
I'm representing the live stream, which is still close to 100. And the question is actually for young Jeremy.
Does that mean it's old Jeremy?
I have no doubt about that. I have no doubt about that.
The old Jeremy gets compliments from the live stream as well for his sociological expertise. But for young Jeremy, since you experienced firsthand the Close to Home program, this person wants to know if you could implement one improvement to that program, what would it be?
Because I entered Close to Home in 2012 when it first started, and actually in September as well, the first couple of weeks actually. And from then to now that I work as a direct care worker in Close to Home, it's the support and the type of programs that they give you before transitioning back into community has improved at least 100% or more. Because before they had a lot of support programs, but now they have more, and it's great that we can give the youth what they need before going back into the community.
All right, so I'm going to go to people, a couple of rules on questions. Keep them short and have a question mark at the end of them. We got about 25 minutes left, so I'd like to get lots of questions. I see lots of hands. And panelists as well. Try to keep them concise so we can get through lots of questions. Tim Lasanti.
Marsha mentioned at the very beginning, students go back to their family for the most part, or extended family. What is New York City doing now for the students that have no family? I think that's the most vulnerable group. Very challenging population to work with, and it's going to increase the percentage rate as we raise the age.
And that was Tim Lasanti, Superintendent of District 79, and that's the part of the Department of Education that planned and implemented the educational changes that correspond with what you've heard several members of the panel talk about in terms of the education.
And an early advocate of close to home. He was right there with us.
Well, can I think we need to invest as a system, society, etc., in programs like the Chelsea Foyer of independent, somewhat independent living that is supportive, so that because the young people coming out of the justice system, while they're very similar to foster care youth, they've had another layer of trauma experiences that the foster care kids have not, and sometimes need a little more support and some other things, because we need to have that kind of growth process for them to be able to then become independent if they don't have a family resource.
I would agree with Anna. I mean, close to home has been a game changer, and I think I mentioned Lisa and the work that OCFS and ACS used to do. These lengthy meetings of trying to do permanency planning for kids from a faraway facility. They were okay, but our numbers were not that great. I mean, most kids, there were actually a lot of kids coming into the foster care system out of OCFS facilities, even though that is carry on prohibited from ever happening. But it happened. I mean, the fact that actually removing the kids far away from their homes, you were disrupting those connections. We need to do more about preventing that. I mean, some of the work that Jeremy actually has been doing at Children's Village is promising, where actually we have a set of interventions where we work with a young person to learn some new behavioral skills. But there's actually a coach doing the same kind of work with the family, and then they eventually come together with ITM. That's paying off. We need to do more. I mean, we're beginning to look at family finding, we need to look more at family engagement. Having said that, we should put all those things in place and do what Anna said. Because some kids, at the end of the day, are not going to have a family, and it's unfair that they just...
Continuum,
Yeah.
basically.
It's unfair that they sometimes are actually just in the juvenile justice system because there's not a roof over their heads.
So I would agree. I think it is a continuum. And so on one end you have the Chelsea foyers, you have Harlem apartments. We are building 30 more in Inwood starting next year. But the challenge is we will never have enough money and enough commitment to build enough affordable housing for all the kids that need it in a city as expensive as ours. So for those kids that are trapped, that believe that they have no one in their lives, I think we have to just exhaust ourselves to prove to them that they have someone. There's no easy way to do that. We've been doing family finding thanks to the Wendy Horowitz Foundation for about 4 years now. And look, for the 40 or 50 kids who really thought they had no one, and we found a family member, that's a game changer. It's not 100%, but we just need to commit ourselves to this idea that no kid should leave us thinking they have no one.
We had a question way in the back.
Hi, good morning. Alex Griffin from Exalt Youth. I just have a question about, maybe Anna or Felipe can answer this, about the conversations that are happening between maybe ACS and Probation Morera. I mean, this is our city, and raise the age is being implemented right now. There's a lot of complexities of implementation and how efficient that process is. Are there conversations happening between maybe ACS and probation, or ACS and other departments around the learning that happened with close to home initiative that could be actually taken over into raise the age, and there's also a lot of deadlines.
Yeah, I mean, we're all in up-team different support groups and implementation teams and all that stuff. So, yes, so what we actually have to safeguard here is that all the conversations are, like, everybody has all the same information. Because this is much bigger than close to home was, we need to be paying a lot of attention to the information flow. so that everybody's operating from the same set of, you know,
Yeah.
of parameters.
And I think Marcia did a good job of showing the trajectory of juvenile justice reform in the city and the state. And, we're getting people out of retirement, like Michelle, to come back and help us figure out how to continue to keep kids out of detention and placement. It's a different set of players for us sometimes. I mean, there's more of the criminal court and DA, so it's convoluted and complicated. I think to Anna's point early on with the structured decision making, you have a set of values, you stick to it, and we all believe that young people should be in their families and communities. They should, if they come to us, should be in the least restrictive setting. And every decision that we're making in the 27 different subcommittees should be guided by that.
All of this stuff, like I was talking about this, all of these things happen with this massive amount of work by city workers from the mayor's office and the departments, by consultants from the Vera Institute, the Casey Foundation, and all these different organizations, by community people, by advocates, service providers. None of this stuff was just somebody went into a room and made a decision. It was all touching bases, making sure that there was buy-in. If we did this without buy-in, they would have been a disaster. Yes? Oh, we gotta wait for it.
Thanks. I have two more questions from the live stream audience.
Just give me one, but I'm gonna keep doing, just so you know, I'm gonna go 2 to the audience here, 1 to you. So give me the first one.
Okay, the first one from Ed Mitchell, I think he works close to home, but he said, if you were granted one wish for close to home, what would it be?
For the whole panel?
Yep.
Or whoever wants to take it.
So,
We don't have to go through
I
it.
mean, this actually it came easy to me. I wish, Lisa, Jeremy would relate to this, that every community in New York City will embrace having a close to home site.
Okay, audience.
Hi, Lenore Dyer from the William T. Grant Foundation, and I'm asking a very basic question because I'm not that familiar with the field. Could you tell me a little bit about the close-to-home facilities? I know this Children's Village, that's huge, but then there are smaller facilities. Could you give me an idea of what we're talking about?
Basically, close to home is keeping youth away from upstate facilities and closer to their families. And most of them, all of them are group home settings. And instead of making you feel like you're incarcerated and you're just an animal, we treat you like your family and you have a home. And we give you everything you need to basically live and education and health and whatever you need, we're there for you and give you everything you need. So, they mentioned earlier about mentoring. We also have mentoring programs. Every youth that is entered into close to home and assigned mentors. So
Martin DePorres, how many kids are in the place that you were in when you were in close to home?
We have 3 facilities and 3 non-secure placement facilities, and every house has a capacity of 6.
And sleep in their own bedrooms? They
Sleep in their own bedrooms.
And does somebody with a big key lock you into that room and look at you through a little plexiglass or not?
It's no OCFS. It's you have your own room. You have the freedom to open and close your door. Well, we do routine bed checks, of course, every 30 minutes. That's how it's supposed to be. But we make sure, and they have the privacy to close the door. They come out the shower. You don't want somebody looking at you when you come out the shower. You're able to close the door, get dressed, and then you come back into the day area or continue with the activity that's going on inside the house. We have group sessions. We talk about our problems. You want to speak privately with a staff member. You're able to do that. If you don't feel comfortable speaking to somebody, you can speak to somebody above the youth care worker, direct care worker, youth specialist. You can speak to somebody above them that if they don't have the power or you don't have the type of relationship with that person, there's always that one person you will build that relationship with.
If I walk by, there's one last question. If I walk by one of the houses and I just didn't know it was there, would I know it was there or would I just
No,
think
you
it was
would not know it's there because it blends in with the community. It looks like when I first got hired in the new facilities, I was literally trying to find it. I'm on my GPS, it says it's right here, but it's not here. And I had to call a staff member that was there when I was there to come outside to the new facility. Oh, it's right here. I passed it 6 times.
Sorry for you.
No, I think exactly what happened to us. I mean, Anna and I were hosting the chief of probation from Los Angeles not that long ago, and Lika was actually opened their facility for this big group of folks from LA. Probation department, and we went to your facility in Brooklyn, and we parked, and they were like, "Are we lost?" And no, that's the facility. I mean, it's hard for folks everywhere when they come to visit to believe that that's actually the same facility where the kids from Trillium used to be at the same time, only with the secure kids sometimes.
Fine, more questions? I'm going to leave you with the full authority to do this, okay? Catherine?
So I have a question and a comment. I know that District 79 has done a fabulous job with educating the younger children. And my question is, in the 207 days that we have left, what are we doing to think about education and job training for the older youth who are going to be coming our way?
Maybe we should give it to Tim Lisanta.
Yeah, Tim can answer that question. But we have, well, while Tim gets the microphone, there's a series of initiatives that are, in place that we're trying to expand. But it is going to be a challenge because the 16 and 17-year-olds who've been through the system often have less than 10 credits to the 44 that they need, and that's going to be a big lift.
So 2 things that are important here, sister. One is we're going to offer the high school equivalency because we're going to have older students. And our district right now, last year, had about 1,400 students who earned the high school equivalency with us, so we're prepared to do that. We also run the best CTE school, which is Career and Technical Education in New York City on 96th Street. And Judith K. High School is right above that now. And so we're prepped to do career and technical education for the older students. So those 2 things are really going to be important. Having the high school equivalency as an option and more career and technical education classes.
So Tim, does that mean the buses that pick kids up? Because I thought, and this is just from dated information, that right now kids get picked up in buses that are close to home. They go to one of 2 schools. Will they now be being taken to a...
Yeah, for example, right now we have a student who is transported, I forget which residency, brings the student to Co-op Tech in the afternoons, and they're still in detention. So, so we're really looking forward to expanding those options.
Yeah, I think something to update on Tim's point is that you could talk about this better than I can. I mean, some of the providers have been very strategic about not every kid has to go to that school, bedroom or home for the full amount of time. And providers are, with the use of the reasoning responsibility, understanding how kids can earn. Close to home has the opportunity of allowing a young person to be in a close to home site and go to a different kind of school setting. And some kids are earning that, and you're doing that consistently.
So for folks from different jurisdictions, initially we had 30+ homes throughout the city. They all went to one school. Then they went to 2 schools. Later on, they made it 2 schools. And so what now you're hearing is, as the program has matured, what's happening is some of the providers are saying, they don't really need to go to those 2 schools. Their needs would be better met by going here or there. And that the Department of Education is also very much cooperating with that. So that's a variation on the original theme, which was originally everybody goes to the same school, and that we staffed that school up a lot because we were afraid kids would run out. Remember, these are kids who used to be in locked youth prisons upstate, and now they're going from a community home to a community school. So at first it was one place, and now it's a bigger diversity.
Adding to the youth going into public schools, a lot of like in Martha-Ports, we have a lot of kids that go into their community schools after spending about 3-4 months in Passages Academy. After we gained, they had to get privileges before anything, regardless, going home on home visits, and they build that trust with the agency. And once they see that whatever specific needs they need, we put them into the community school and they travel. We transport them, and among them getting discharged, they also build that trust to go by themselves to learn the route to go to school. So before getting released into the community, about about a couple weeks before getting released because multiple of our residents are already discharged from the agency. And we just had a discharge on Thursday, and he was put into a GED program as well because he's 17 already, and he has little amount of credits. So we put him in the GED program, and he does travel along to the city every day.
Thanks.
Yeah, one more question from the live stream. This is a question from Boston. And this person says, one of the issues we face in Boston is that when youth have significant gang affiliation issues, they don't always feel safe navigating through the city. What do you do in New York around this?
So we do, Felipe knows, we have a number of young people that have significant gang affiliation. Some would see it as a problem, some are still connected to it because that's how you survive the neighborhood. I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. We haven't found a great solution. What we have found, though, is if that child has a family in that neighborhood, working with the family around a strategy to help that young person begin to disengage. And that's a big piece of our family coaching work, where we say, look, don't lose hope. Just because he feels that, or she feels that the only way she survives living here is by maintaining this affiliation. There are things that you can do to help her and help him think differently about survival. And I gotta tell you, it's not that easy.
Yeah, let me boil it a little further closer to the ground and ask you to respond. You ever have any gang members show up at the front door of one of your facilities trying to beat up another gang member? Or you ever have shot callers calling into your facilities to have one kid shank another kid?
Yes.
And what, so, talk, because most of the people in correctional facilities spend a lot of time thinking about ways to search kids when they come to and from visitation, to keep phone calls monitored, to separate kids. And you know what it's like in correctional facilities. A lot of time is spent trying to figure out how to deal with this issue. How does that play itself out?
The advantage in a correctional facility is that for the most part, you are in a contained space, and so you can actually manage that space and sweep it. When you're close to home, as you heard from Jeremy, you walk into school, you know that you can stick something under the root of a tree in a flower pot. And typically when something bad happens, we find that it's because we missed something. And that's human error. This is a work that works best when adults are in charge and are responsive and engaged. And you know, in that game, there's the risk of human error. What we find that works best for us is not to focus on what happened at that moment, but to work with ACS and all the other oversight agencies to say, what can we learn from this and how do we prevent it? Because things will happen, and there's a tendency in our work to focus on what happened, and it takes up a lot of bandwidth, and you miss the opportunity to learn from it and strategize for the next. That will happen again.
I mean, I think we also miss an opportunity to learn from these experiences from the young people themselves. Something happens and we all try to figure out what happened, how do we fix it? And to me, the use of restorative justice practices in these situations is critical. So if I may tell you a little story about Arches and why this message is important. In Arches, the message is always, this is a safe space. We, try to deal with our situations here, et cetera, et cetera. There was one situation in the Bronx recently where two young people in the group had an issue with each other. One of them called his people, and they rolled up, to the place. And again, this is a double-edged story because nothing is linear in this work, straightforward. They roll up, the main person rolling up with the group to start something, looks around and says, wait, this Arches? You're all on the Arches? Forget it, we're out. They left, okay? So we have to deal with that fact that that young person was still in the life, but okay. But that was the sense of respect. Then the agency that runs that Arches program was going to meet to see if they were going to discharge or, the person, the young man who called. And as they were doing so, the young man came back and next day, whenever. I said, look, I was thinking about this, I was wrong, I put people in danger, that's not cool, I'm gonna make it right with the other guy. He went to the other guy's neighborhood, it was, as he described it, his corner, and they, worked it out. And then they came back and ran the group about what had happened and how they had resolved it. And so that happens a lot in the ARCHES programs, in terms of that kind of insight. So yeah, a lot of times, we say, oh, they can't travel because they're too scared, whatever. That is true, and we have to take that into consideration. They often can come up with solutions sometimes. And if you build the right community and the right expectations, that high expectations of, we trust you to figure this out, guys. We can't spend our life just, hurting each other. It happens.
All right, last question, and what I want the panelists to do is answer the question and give any final thoughts you all have.
Hi, I'm Lisa Freeman from the Legal Aid Society. So we are a huge supporter, obviously, of close to home. And I realize that the defunding...
Can you get a little closer to you? Yeah.
I realize that the defunding came as I think as a surprise to many of us. So I don't know if this report was planned to be released now or what, but the question of how to measure the success so that we can sell it most effectively is what's really on my mind. And maybe recidivism is not the right measure, but I guess I'm just curious, what is anticipated in terms of studies to try to support the efficacy of this? Like, the educational data is fantastic, and I don't mean to minimize it, but the lack of an increase in crime seems like a hard message to, it's accurate, it's a great message, but I don't know that it conveys itself all that well to the public at large. So basically, what do you anticipate in terms of data or hope to do?
Yeah, so we're actually in the midst of that kind of work. There's a copy of the report by the Center for Children Law and Policy outside, which actually is more qualitative in nature than quantitative in nature, but it really kind of looks at what Close to Home has done well. I think Yumari Martinez is somewhere in the audience. Our most recent report on Close to Home to the Assembly and the Senate actually really focus on data in terms of improvements. And we're working very, very closely actually with the state, OCFS and the CES, to kind of build a matrix to be able to measure recidivism on a yearly basis. Some of the data that I began looking at with Senator Workman and other folks is actually showing that the likelihood of keeping arrested is actually decreasing significantly as the program matures, which is actually kind of counterintuitive because we're getting less kids and we will have expected they're actually going to be harder than ever. So I think the data is on our side. Again, remember that we're doing two things. I think Anna and I talk about this often. We are shrinking the number of kids who are in the system by all the good work that she's doing. The reality that used to be before, that we presented when a kid will begin institutional placement, is not education anymore. Every one of these kids is given a chance in the community first. Is actually given multiple chances in the community first. By the time they make it to Close to Home, they're actually the right kind of kids that should be with us. And by the nature of their needs, is challenging. Having said that, I think we're turning their life around, and the data will be coming up soon. But I think at the end of the day, we need to also change the discourse of how we measure Close to Home or how we measure juvenile justice. And now it sounded like Jeffrey Butts, but it really should be about positive outcomes, right? Like, when you were dealing with your daughter playing the violin, you went through the pain and suffering of her practicing, but you knew that it would be good for her self-esteem, and that's hard to measure, right? She didn't make it to the concert hall, right? No,
She did not. We weren't thinking, I hope she's good at this so she doesn't get rearrested. We don't measure our own kids by recidivism rates. We measure them by a whole bunch of
and I think we have an opportunity to start doing that. How we measure our kids that are showing to school on a daily basis, even though it's hard to get them out of the house sometimes, for the three that have a home. But these kids in Close to Home are making it to school every day, and they are accumulating credits at a rate that is impressive. But the data is coming.
So I just want to say, this is a pre-publication copy. We did not plan on doing this right now. We planned on doing it in the fall. we accelerated the conversation and the release of some of the data because of the budget kerfuffle, but it wasn't specifically meant to be now. And we will do something again in the fall. I'm very heartened by this, and I'm sitting here, my mind's exploding about the kinds of conversations I may want to host in the fall when we finally have the report, and maybe even bring in some of the folks who are on live stream, so that if there are cities and states that are considering this type of thing, we might want to have them in the room with many of the folks that are here from the community, from the government, to maybe help, help folks learn even more about it from a very elemental level. But step one is, it has to be funded in the next 2 weeks. So, final remarks from any of the panelists. Who wants to go first?
We've been talking for a long time.
I'm okay to bang the gavel. Anybody want to say anything? Because we're at 12:02. We're a little over. So if folks are good. Everybody, all right, thank you very much.
I know you're not. I'm sad about you know it's been a bumpy ride all the way up.
No, well, as you can see, it's a bumpy ride a little now, so. I'm still available.